Welcome, workers and friends. Welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm here, as always, my great co-host, Australian union organizer, David Fox. How are things down under today?
Yeah, good morning. No, everything's going well at the moment. It's actually it's not so cold this morning for our winter. It's a nice misty, rainy morning. So it was nice to see that once instead of a complete frost and minus 5 degrees Celsius. So I'm not freezing this morning. Mm-hmm.
Right on. We're continuing our study of We Are City Builders. We try to do one work meeting and it's like news updates and interviews, and one study meeting and alternating on this program. We're continuing selections of the Center for Political Innovation study manual, edited by Caleb Maupin. And today we're going to be going over Lenin's letter to the American workers. And with us, we're very happily joined by good friends of the Center for Political Innovation, Joe Gale. How are you today, sir?
Doing very well. I went to the beach today. I think I'm a little sunburned, but other than that, I'm doing very well. It's great to be on the show, finally. Doing good.
Right on, man. Well, we haven't... I didn't do a lot of the people we have on the show, we usually do a quick interview with them before. Maybe if you could just very briefly introduce yourself to our viewers.
No problem. I'm Joe Gale, member of the Communist Party USA, DSA, Students and Youth for New America. I've done work with many other organizations, PSL, you name it, I've been all over. Started out as a Republican because I grew up in a very military and police family, so I was just brought up in that way. But after seeing the wreck that the Iraq and Afghanistan war was, and seeing how impoverished the global South was, I decided to look more into it, and I came to the conclusion that capitalism was not the way to go about things. That it was the root of all the problems in the world. Imperialism, the profits being above everything else. And so I was never a liberal. I never had a liberal phase. I went from being conservative. Then I became socially liberal, and then I finally became a socially liberal. And I was a libertarian who believed in gay rights, and I was anti-racist. But then I quickly became a Marxist. I've been active since 2014, 2015. I've done mutual aid, especially during COVID. I've helped feed people around Long Island during the lockdown. You might know me from InfoWars. I was interviewed by InfoWars back in 2016. It kind of made the rounds, made me look pretty well. It backfired on them, I think, because I think they wanted a screaming, screaming leftist, typical, but they got someone who was very polite and answered every question they had. So I'm also a member of the Center for Political Innovation, and I fancy myself a revolutionary patriot, which that means I believe that socialism should be achieved in the United States through the conditions of the United States through, decolonization, a lot of colonial structures, bringing socialism to this country through any way possible that fits these material conditions. So that's pretty much it.
Right on, man. And we're also very happily and honored to be joined with Ryan Cotton. You might know him from his comments as Class Analysis. How are you today, brother?
Hey, I'm doing really good. Got a day off for this meeting, so I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I don't believe we've had you on this channel either. Maybe you could do the same and give us a brief statement to introduce yourself to our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Ryan. I'm a pharmacist in Oakland, in the Bay Area of California. I also publish some Marxist projects on my YouTube page, Class Analysis. Most recently published a 2.5 hour documentary about the history of U.S. imperialism. So I became radicalized working in retail pharmacy, actually. Seeing countless of my patients get burned by a healthcare system that puts profits before patients. So in pharmacy school, we were taught a philosophy of care that always puts patients first. Seeing patients frustrated with the insurance policies and drug costs, I started to work in the health insurance industry. And in that industry, I quickly realized that there was a fundamental misalignment between the interests of my patients and the financial interests of healthcare here in the United States. So I became a pharmacist to fight for my patients. Now I see fighting imperialism and advocating for socialism as the only way to resolve the contradictions that I see in healthcare today. Outside of that, I've started to get active with the CPI, Center for Political Innovation. I'm helping the organization kind of define what would socialism look like in America.
Right on. Well, let's see, Ryan Cotton. Is there any way you could give us a little bit of background behind the material we're about to read and discuss today?
Yeah, so what we're going to be looking at, it's published in the Center for Political Innovation Education Manual, We Are City Builders. I also have another copy here from 1934, Letter to American Workers. And so there's a really good introduction in here by communist Alex Trachtenberg, who's an early communist leader in the CPU, and he was a member of the CPUSA early on. So this text was written in 1918, which was actually during World War I. It was written in August 20th or August 22nd, somewhere in there. And this is an important period. There's a quote by Lenin somewhere that says, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. And so a lot of stuff happens in a few years here. So it's during World War II, following the Soviet October Revolution of 1917, that ended Russia's participation in World War I. However, the war in Russia would continue with the Civil War, as we will see. This was actually written during one of the darkest hours of the Russian Revolution. Not only was Russia dealing with a civil war immediately after the 1917 revolution, they were invaded by 15 countries. They had imperialist attacks from all sides. They're also dealing with an economic depression and a famine at the same time. So during the Russian Civil War, there was kind of three factions. There were the Bolsheviks the Red Army. And there's also a few other socialist groups from Ukraine, China, and Mongolian communists, and some anarchists who were aligned with them. There was the White Army, which was the Allied powers who backed a counter-revolutionary coalition between the Kerenskyites and the Tsarist monarchists. And there were the separatists, or the Central Powers, which was mostly Germany, but also the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And so right before this text was written, again, August 1918, there was a very important treaty that happened in March between Russia and Germany, called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I don't know if I'm saying that, but it was a very, very harsh treaty. And this was something I learned about looking into the history of this text. So the treaty, Germany was invading Russia after their revolution, and the Russians, of course, didn't like this. They signed this treaty with the Germans. It was a harsh treaty, which included the annexation of large territories from Russia. So they gave up Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Finland, and the Baltics. And the last thing I'll say is that it was before another famous treaty, which happened in November 1918, the Treaty of Versailles, which is considered very harsh as well, but probably some would say not as harsh as the treaty that Russia had to deal with. So even though they ended their involvement with World War I, the war continued as a civil war. The imperialists prolonged the war 5 more years in Russia, didn't end until 1923. And I'll hand it over to the next person.
Does anyone else have anything to say before we start reading the material? No, David Fox. Is there any is there any specific way it relates to Australia in World War One?
Well, we're just having a brief. I was just having a brief chat with Joe before we started, and basically, although there was very limited material that was actually on Australia around about that time, I think we're pretty much Lenin's work. I was actually on Australia. I sent the link to your message of Dust. I don't know if you can put that up on the chat there. It was only a small one. It was actually about the Australian Labor Party. It was the first time, I think it was the second time a Labor Party in Australia was elected to federal government. They had both control of the houses, and he actually put it. And what Lenin actually explained is it was an interesting so-called Workers' Party. It actually had power in both houses of the Australian Parliament, and even still has power in the upper house. And still, capital is not under threat. And then he described it as being a liberal bourgeois party with the most capital-serving elements there from the workers' movement in there. And then he described the Liberals as conservative. So it's quite an interesting little article. But what also too, I think also too, it was a little bit mentioned about Australia in William Z. Foster's book, History of Three Internationals, because mind you, through the 1800s, I mean, Australia was still a bunch of colonies until it federated in 1901, become a nation. But the fact is, it still had a lot of development to catch up probably to the rest of the world, where like America, Europe, and Britain were pretty much more advanced industrial nations. We're still primarily agricultural mining here. So we had a lot of industries to catch up. I mean, World War One exposed it. I mean, we still had to get permission from Britain to actually start our own steel industry. That's just how stupid things were. But that's that's where that comes in. But the formation of World War One sort of it was the turning events, and then later on. But there was Lenin only had limited information for us about Australia and his works here. But it'll be interesting to hear. I'll go through all this as well.
Ryan, am I clear that the United States was one of those countries that invaded the Soviet Union? Is that correct? Here's Lenin writing a letter to a country that has just invaded his recent, after his recent revolution, and applying directly to the working class here. I think that's really beautiful thing that anti-war communist and communists in general would apply, would appeal to workers of all countries unite. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and read. Did you have anything to say, Joe or David?
One more thing.
Joe first.
Joe.
Real quick. So the interesting thing about the Americans who invaded Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution is, and the Civil War in general, was that there was a regiment of, I believe, Marines. I'm not sure which one that switched sides. Some of them were Eastern European that went over to fight, and when they saw what was going on with the peasants, the complete overhaul of the Russian society, they switched sides and fought for the Bolsheviks. And when Lenin heard about that, it might have inspired him a little bit, but who knows?
Wow. That is beautiful. If David Rovics is listening, that would be a great, that would make a great song. Kind of like an American version of St. Patrick's Battalion switching and, Eastern European version of St. Patrick's Battalion switching to fight with the Russians. That is absolutely beautiful. Comrade Fox?
Yeah, just quickly, I want to hold up. Also, too, to explain that during that period too of that time of the invasion of Soviet Russia, remember the Australian and New Zealand forces, the Anzac, it was actually part of the British forces at the time. We have our British commanders, everything from World War One onwards, and yes, Australia and New Zealand was also involved in the invasion of it. But yeah, it wasn't Australia and New Zealand weren't separate entities at all during that World War One period. We all came under the British Crown and British command and British forces that fought in World War One there. So just sort of clarify that if you're trying to eliminate any confusion there.
All right, so we'll get right into the reading material. If you are following along there at home or wherever you may be. We are on page 179 in the Center for Political Innovation Educational Manual. We're going to be reading this aloud, paragraph by paragraph. It's quite a long book. I mean, it's not a book. It's quite a long session, several pages. So just try to follow it through us, and we'll be answering the questions and having discussion afterwards. So without further ado, Letter to the American Workers by Vladimir Lenin, 1918. Comrades, a Russian Bolshevik who took part in the 1905 revolution and who lived in your country for many years afterwards, has offered to convey my letter to you. I have accepted his proposal all the more gladly because just at the present time, the American revolutionary workers have to play an exceptionally important role as uncompromising enemies of American imperialism. The freshest, strongest, and latest enjoying the worldwide slaughter of nations for the division of capital profits. At this very moment, the American multimillionaires, these modern slave owners, have turned an exceptionally tragic page in the bloody history of bloody imperialism. By giving their approval, whether direct or indirect, open or hypocritically concerned, makes no difference to the armed expedition launched by the brutal Anglo-Japanese imperialists for the purpose of throttling the first socialist republic. Comrade Fox?
Yep. The hidden of modern civilized America opened with one of those great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars of which there have been so few compared to the vast numbers of wars of conquest, which, like the present imperialist war, were caused by squabbles among kings, landowners, or capitalists over the division of usurped lands or ill-gotten gains. That was the war the American people waged against the British robbers who oppressed America and held her in colonial slavery, in the same way as these civilized bloodsuckers are still oppressing and holding in colonial slavery hundreds of millions of people in India, Egypt, and all parts of the world. Joe?
About 150 years have passed since then. Bourgeois civilization has borne all its luxurious fruits. America has taken first place among the free and educated nations in the level of development of the productive forces of collective human endeavor. And the utilization of machinery and all of the wonders of modern engineering at the same time, America has become one of the foremost countries in regard to the depth of the abyss which lies between a handful of arrogant multimillionaires who wallow in filth and luxury and the millions of working people who constantly live on in the verge of pauperism. The American people, who set the world an example in waging a revolutionary war against feudal slavery, now find themselves in the latest capitalist stage of wage slavery to a handful of multimillionaires, and find themselves playing the role of hired thugs who, for the first benefit of wealthy scoundrels, throttled the Philippines in 1898 and the pretext of liberating them, and are throttling the Russian Socialist Republic in 1918 on the pretext of protecting it from the Germans. The 4 years of the imperialist slaughter of nations, however, have not passed in vain. The description of the people by the scoundrels of both robber groups, the British and the German, have been utterly exposed by indisputable and obvious facts. The results of the 4 years of war have revealed the general law of capitalism as applied to war between robbers for the division of spoils. The richest and strongest profited and grabbed most, while the weakest were utterly robbed, tormented, crushed, and strangled. Ryan?
The British imperialist robbers were the strongest in a number of colonial slaves. The British capitalists have not lost an inch of their territory they grabbed over the centuries, but they have grabbed all the Germans' colonies in Africa. They have grabbed Mesopotamia and Palestine. They have throttled Greece and have begun to plunder Russia.
The German imperial... Go ahead. Go ahead.
The German imperialist robbers were the strongest in the organization of discipline in their armies, but weaker in regard to colonies. They have lost all their colonies, but plundered half of Europe and throttled the largest number of small countries and weak nations.
What a great war of liberation on both sides. Liberation. How well the robbers of both groups, the Anglo-French and the German capitalists, together with their lackeys, the social chauvinists, i.e., the socialists who went over to the side of, quote, their own, quote, unquote, bourgeoisie, have, quote, defended their country, unquote. The American multimillionaires were perhaps richest of all, and geographically the most secure. They have profited more than all the rest. They have converted all, even the richest countries, into their tributaries. They have grabbed hundreds of billions of dollars, and every dollar is sullied with filth. The filth of the secret treaties between Britain and their, quote, allies, unquote, between Germany and her vassals, treaties for the divisions of the spoils, treaties of mutual, quote, aid, unquote, for oppressing the workers and persecuting the internationalist socialists. Every dollar is sullied with the filth of, quote, profitable, unquote, war contracts, which in every country made the rich richer and the poor poorer. And every dollar is stained with blood. From the ocean of blood that has been shed by the 10 million killed and 20 million maimed in the great, noble, liberating, and holy war, to decide whether the British or the German robbers are to get the most of the spoils, whether the British or the German thugs are the foremost in throttling the weak nations all over the world.
While the German robbers broke all the records in war atrocities, the British have broken all records not only in the number of colonies they have grabbed, but also in the subtlety of their disgusting hypocrisy. This very day, the Anglo-French and American bourgeois newspapers, are spreading in millions and millions of copies lies, slander about Russia, and are hypocritically justifying their predatory expedition against her on the plea that they want to protect Russia from the Germans. It does not require many words to refute this despicable and hideous lie. It is sufficient to point to one well-known fact. In October 1917, after the Russian workers had overthrown their imperialist government, the Soviet government, the government of the revolutionary workers and peasants, openly proposed a just peace, a peace without annexations or indemnities, a peace that fully guaranteed equal rights to all nations, and it was proposed such a peace to all the belligerent countries. Joe.
Belligerent country.
Yes,
182, top left.
Oh, yeah. It was, oh, that's where I was. It was the Anglo-French and the American bourgeoisie who refused to accept our proposal. It was they who even refused to talk to us about a general peace. It was they who betrayed the interests of all nations. It was they who prolonged the imperialist slaughter. It was they who, banking on the possibility of dragging Russia back into the imperialist war, refused to take part in the peace negotiations, and thereby gave a free hand to the no less predatory German capitalists who imposed the annexionist and harsh Brest peace upon Russia. It is difficult to imagine anything more disgusting than hypocrisy which the Anglo-French and the American bourgeoisie are now blaming us for. The Brest Peace Treaty. The very capitalists of those countries which could have turned the Brest negotiations into general negotiations for a general peace are now our accusers. The Anglo-French imperialist vultures who have profited from the plunder of colonies and the slaughter of nations have prolonged the war for nearly a whole year after Brest. And yet they accuse us, the Bolsheviks, who proposed a just peace of all countries. They accuse us, who more up the published and exposed to public disgrace the secret criminal treaties concluded between the ex-Tsar and the Anglo-French capitalists.
The workers of the world, no matter in what country they live, greet us, sympathize with us, applaud us for breaking the iron ring of imperialist ties, of sordid imperialist treaties, of imperialist chains, for breaking through to freedom and making the heaviest sacrifices in doing so. For as a socialist republic, although torn and plundered by the imperialists, keeping out of the imperialist war and raising the banner of peace, the banner of socialism for the whole world to see. Small wonder that the imperialists that the international imperialist gang hates us for this and accuses us that all the lackeys of the imperialists, including the right socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, also accuse us. The hatred of these watchdogs of imperialism express for the Bolsheviks and the sympathy of the class-conscious workers of the world convince us more than ever of the justice of our cause.
A real socialist world will not fail to understand that for the sake of achieving victory over the bourgeoisie, for the sake of power passing to the workers, for the sake of starting the world proletarian revolution, we cannot and must not hesitate to make the heaviest sacrifices, including the sacrifice of part of our territory, the sacrifice of heavy defeats at the hand of imperialism. A real socialist would have proved by deeds his willingness for his country to make the greatest sacrifice, to give a real push forward to the cause of socialist revolution. For the sake of their cause, that is, for the sake of winning world hegemony, the imperialists of Britain and Germany have not hesitated to utterly ruin the throttle a whole number of countries, from Belgium to Serbia to Palestine and Mesopotamia. But most socialists wait with their cause and cause of liberating the working people of the whole world from the yoke of capital, of winning universal and lasting peace until a path without sacrifice is found. Must they fear to open the battle until an easy victory is guaranteed? Must they place the integrity and security of their bourgeois created fatherland above the interests of the world socialist revolution? The scoundrels in the international socialist movements who think this way, whose lackeys who grovel to bourgeois morality, thrice stand condemned.
The Anglo-French and American imperialist vultures accuse us of concluding an agreement with the German imperialism. What hypocrites! What scoundrels they are to slander the workers' government while trembling because of the sympathy displayed towards us by the workers of their own countries. But their hypocrisy will be exposed. They pretend not to see the difference between an agreement entering into by socialists with the bourgeoisie, their own or foreign, against the workers, against the working people, and an agreement entered into for the protection of the workers who have defeated their bourgeoisie with the bourgeoisie of one national colour against the bourgeoisie of another colour in order that the proletariat may take advantage of the antagonisms between the different groups of the bourgeoisie. In actual fact, even every European sees this difference very well. And as I shall show in a moment, the American people have had a particularly striking illustration of it in their own history. There are agreements and agreements. There are maggots and faggots, as the French say.
When in February 1918, the German imperialist vultures hurled their forces against unarmed, demobilized Russia, who had relied on the international solidarity of the proletariat before the world revolution had finally matured, I did not hesitate for a moment to enter into an agreement with the French monarchists, Captain Soudul, a French army officer who, in words, sympathized with the Bolsheviks, but was in deeds a loyal and faithful servant of the French imperialism. Brought the French officer de Lubasov to see me. I'm your monarchist. My only aim is to secure the defeat of Germany. De Lubasov declared to me, that goes without saying. Kalava Sandia. I replied, but this did not in the least prevent me from entering into an agreement with de Lubasov concerning certain services that French army officers, experts in explosives, were ready to render us by blowing up railway lines in order to hinder the German invasion. This is an example of an agreement, of which every class-conscious worker will approve, an agreement in the interests of socialism. The French monarchist and I shook hands, although we knew that each of us would willingly hang his partner, but for a time our interests coincided. Against the advancing rapacious Germans, we, in the interests of the Russian and the world socialist revolution, utilized the equally rapacious counter-interests of other imperialists. In this way, we served the interests of the working class of Russia and of other countries. We strengthened the proletariat and weakened the bourgeoisie of the whole world. We resorted to the methods most legitimate and essential in every war of maneuver, stratagem, retreat, and anticipation for the moment when the rapidly maturing proletarian revolution in a number of advanced countries completely matured.
However, much of the Anglo-French and American imperialist sharks fume with rage. However much they slander us, no matter how much millions they spend on bribing the right socialist revolutionary, Mensheviks, and other patriotic newspapers. I shall not hesitate 1 second to enter in a similar agreement with the German imperialist vultures if an attack upon Russia by the Anglo-French troops calls for it. And I know perfectly well that my tactics will be approved by the class-conscious proletariat of Russia, Germany, France, Britain, America, in short, the whole civilized world. Such tactics will ease the task of the socialist revolution, will hasten it, will weaken the international bourgeoisie, will strengthen the position of the working class, which is defeating the bourgeoisie.
The American people resorted to these tactics long ago to the advantage of their revolution, when they waged their great war of liberation against British oppressors. They had also against them the French and Spanish oppressors, who owned a part of what is now the United States of North America. In their audacious war for freedom, the American people also entered into agreements with some oppressors against others for the purpose of weakening the oppressors and straightening those who were fighting in a revolutionary manner against oppression, for the purpose of serving the interest of the oppressed people. The American people took advantage of the strife between the French, the Spanish, and the British. Sometimes they even fought side by side with the forces of French and Spanish oppressors against British oppressors. First, they defeated the British and then freed themselves, partly by ransom, from the French and the Spanish. Comrade Fox? 186.
Historical action is not the pavement of Nevsky Prospect, said the great Russian revolutionary Chernyshevsky. A revolutionary would not agree to the proletarian revolution only on the condition that it proceeds easily and smoothly. That there is, from the outset, combined action on the part of the proletarians of different countries, that there are guarantees against defeats, that the road of the revolution is broad, free, and straight, that it will not be necessary during the march to victory to sustain the heaviest casualties, to bide one's time in a besieged fortress, or to make one's way along extremely narrow, impassable, winding, and dangerous mountain tracks. Such a person is no revolutionary. He has not freed himself from the predatory of the bourgeois intellectuals. Such a person will be found constantly slipping into the camp of the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie, like our right socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and even, although more rarely, left socialist revolutionaries. Joe.
Echoing the bourgeoisie, those gentlemen like to blame us for the chaos of the revolution, for the destruction of industry, for the unemployment and the food shortage. How hypocritical these accusations are, coming from those who welcomed and supported the imperialist war, or who entered into an agreement with Kerensky, who continued the war. It is this imperialist war that is the cause of all these misfortunes. The revolution engendered by the war cannot avoid the terrible difficulties and suffering bequeathed by it by the prolonged, ruinous, reactionary slaughter of the nations. To blame us for the destruction of industry or for the terror is either hypocrisy or dull-witted pedantry. It reveals an inability to understand the basic conditions of a fierce class struggle, raised to the highest degree of the intensity that is called revolution. Even when accusers of this type do recognize the class struggle, they limit themselves to verbal recognition. Actually, they constantly slip into the Philistine utopia of class agreement and collaboration. For in revolutionary epochs, the class struggle has always inevitably and in every country assumed the form of civil war. And civil war is inconceivable without the severest destruction, terror, and the restriction of formal democracy in the interests of this war. Only unctuous parsons Whether Christian or secular, and the persons of parliamentary socialists cannot see, understand, and feel this necessity. Only a life less man in the muffler can shun the revolution for the reason instead of plunging into battle with the utmost ardor and determination. At a time when history demands that the greatest problems of humanity be solved by struggle and war.
The American people have a revolutionary tradition, which has been adopted by the best representatives of the American proletariat, who have repeatedly expressed their complete solidarity with us Bolsheviks. The tradition is the War of Liberation against the British in the 18th century and the Civil War in the 19th century. In some respects, if we only take into consideration the destruction of some branches of industry and of the national economy, America in the 1870s was behind in 1860. But what a pedant, what an idiot would anyone be to deny on these grounds the immense, world historic, progressive, and revolutionary significance of the American Civil War of 1863 to 1865.
The representatives of the bourgeoisie understand that for the sake of overthrowing Negro slavery, of overthrowing the rule of the slave owners, it was worth letting the country grow through long years of civil war, through the abysmal ruin, destruction, and terror accompanying every war. But now, when we confronted with the vastly greater task of overthrowing capitalist wage slavery, of overthrowing the rule of the bourgeoisie, now the representatives and defenders of the bourgeoisie, and also the reformist socialists who have been frightened by the bourgeoisie, are shunning the revolution, cannot and do not want to understand that civil war is necessary and legitimate.
The American workers will not follow the bourgeoisie. They will be with us for civil war against the bourgeoisie. The whole history of the world and of the American labour movement strengthens my conviction that this is so. I also recall the words of one of the most beloved leaders of the American proletariat, Eugene Debs, who wrote in The Appeal to Reason, I believe towards the end of 1915 in the article, What Shall I Fight For? I quoted this article at the beginning of 1916 at a public meeting of workers in Bern, Switzerland, that he, Debs, would rather be shot than vote credits for the present criminal and reactionary war that he, Debs, knows for only one wholly and, from the proletarian standpoint, legitimate war, namely the war against the capitalists, the war to liberate mankind from wage slavery. I am not surprised that Wilson, the head of the American multi-millionaires and servant of the capitalist sharks, has thrown Debs into prison. Let the bourgeoisie be brutal to the true internationalists, to the true representatives of the revolutionary proletariat. The more fierce and brutal they are, the nearer the day of their victorious proletarian revolution. Chuck.
We are blamed for the destruction caused by our revolution. Who are the accusers? The hangers-on of the bourgeoisie, of that very bourgeoisie who during the 4 years of the imperialist war have destroyed almost the whole of European culture and have reduced Europe to barbarism, brutality, and starvation. These bourgeoisie now demand we should not take a revolution on these ruins, amidst this wreckage of culture, amidst the wreckage and ruin created by the war, nor with the people who have been brutalized by the war. How humane and righteous the bourgeoisie are. Their servants accuse us of resorting to terror. The British bourgeoisie have forgotten that their 1649, the French bourgeoisie have forgotten their 1793. Terror was just legitimate when the bourgeoisie resorted to it for their own benefit against feudalism. Terror became monstrous and criminal when the workers and poor peasants dared to use it against the bourgeoisie. Terror was just and legitimate when used for the purpose of substituting one exploiting minority for another exploiting minority. Terror became monstrous and criminal when it began to be used for the purpose of overthrowing every exploiting minority to be used for the interests of the vast actual majority, in the interests of the proletariat and semi-proletariat, the working class and the poor peasants. The international imperialist bourgeoisie have slaughtered 10 million men and maimed 20 million in their war. The war so decide whether the British or German vultures are to rule the world.
In our war, the war of the oppressed and exploited against the oppressors and the exploiters, half results in 500,000 or 1 million casualties in all countries. The bourgeoisie will say that the former casualties are justified, while the latter are criminal. The proletariat will have something entirely different to say. Now, amidst the horrors of the imperialist war, the proletariat is receiving a most vivid and striking illustration of the great truth taught by all revolutionaries and bequeathed by the workers by their best teachers, the founders of modern socialism. This truth is that no revolution can be successful unless the resistance of the exploiters is crushed. When we, the workers and the toiling peasants, captured state power, it must be our duty to crush the resistance of the exploiters. We are proud we have been doing this. We regret we were not doing it with sufficient firmness and determination.
We know that fierce resistance to the socialist revolution on the part of the bourgeoisie is inevitable in all countries, and that this resistance will grow with the growth of this revolution. The proletariat will crush this resistance. During the struggle against resisting bourgeoisie, it will finally mature for victory and for power. Let the corrupt bourgeois press shout to the whole world about every mistake our revolution makes. We are not daunted by our mistakes. People have not become saints because the revolution has begun. The toiling classes, who for centuries have been oppressed, downtrodden, and forcibly held in the vice of poverty, brutality, and ignorance, cannot avoid mistakes when making a revolution. And as I pointed out once before, the corpse of bourgeois society cannot be nailed in a coffin and buried. The corpse of capitalism is decaying and disintegrating into our midst, polluting the air and poisoning our lives, enmeshing that which is new, flesh, young and virile, into thousands of threads and bonds of that which is old, morbid, and decaying.
For every 100 mistakes we commit, and which the bourgeoisie and their lackeys, brackets, including our own Mensheviks and right socialist revolutionaries, shout about to the whole world, 10,000 great and heroic deeds are performed, greater and more heroic because they are simple and inconspicuous amid the everyday life of a factory district or remote village, performed by people who are not accustomed, in brackets again, have no opportunity to shout to the whole world about their success. But even if the contrary were true, although I know such an assumption is wrong, even if we committed 10,000 mistakes for every 100 correct actions we performed, even in that case, our revolution would be great and invincible. And so it will be in the eyes of world history, because for the first time, not the minority, not the rich alone, not the educated alone, but the real people, the vast majority of the working people, are themselves building a new life, are by their own experience solving the most difficult problems of socialist organisation. Joe.
Every mistake committed in the course of such work, in the course of the most conscientious and earnest work of tens of millions of simple workers and peasants in reorganizing their whole life, every such mistake is worth thousands and millions of lawless successes achieved by the exploiting minority. Successes in swindling and duping the working people, for only through such mistakes will the workers and peasants learn to build the new life, learn to do without capitalists. Only in this way will they hack a path for themselves through thousands of obstacles to victorious socialism. Mistakes are being committed in the course of the revolutionary work by our peasants who, at one stroke, in one night, October 25th to 26th, 1917, entirely abolished the private ownership of land and are now, month after month, overcoming tremendous difficulties and correcting their mistakes themselves, solving in a practical way the most difficult task of organizing new conditions of economic life, of fighting the kulaks, providing land for the working people and not for the rich, and of changing to communist large-scale agriculture. Mistakes are being committed in the course of their revolutionary work by our workers, who have already, after a few months, nationalized almost all the biggest factories and plants, and are learning by hard, everyday work the new task of managing whole branches of industry, with setting the nationalized enterprises going. overcoming the powerful resistance of Ontario. Petty bourgeois mentality and selfishness, and brick by brick, are laying the foundation of new social ties, of a new labor discipline, of a new influence of the workers' trade unions over their members.
Mistakes are being committed in the course of their revolutionary work by our Soviets, which were created as far back as 1905 by a mighty upsurge of the people. The Soviets of workers and peasants are a new type of state, a new and higher type of democracy, a form of proletariat dictatorship, a means of administering the state without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. For the first time, democracy is here serving the people, the working people, and has ceased to be the democracy for the rich, as it still is in all bourgeois republics, even the most democratic. For the first time, the people are grappling on a scale involving 100 million with the problem of implementing the dictatorship of the proletariat and semi-proletariat, a problem which, if not solved, makes socialism out of the question.
Let the pedants, or the people whose minds are incurably stuffed with the bourgeois democratic or parliamentary prejudices, shake their heads in perplexity about our Soviets, about the absence of direct elections, for example. Those people have forgotten nothing and have learned nothing during the period of the great upheavals of 1914 to 17. The combination of the proletarian dictatorship, which the new democracy for the working people, of civil war with the widest participation of the peoples in politics. Such a combination cannot be brought about at one stroke, nor does it fit in with the outworn modes of routine parliamentary democracy. The contours of a new world, the world of socialism, arising before us in the shape of the Soviet Republic. It is not surprising that this world does not come into being ready-made, does not spring forth like Minerva from the head of Jupiter.
The old bourgeois democratic constitutions waxed eloquent about formal equality and right of assembly, but our proletarian and peasant Soviet constitution cast aside the hypocrisy of formal equality. When the bourgeois republicans overturned thrones, they did not worry about formal equality between monarchists and republicans. When it is a matter of overthrowing the bourgeoisie, only traitors or idiots can demand formal equality of rights for the bourgeoisie. Freedom of assembly for workers and peasants is not worth a farthing when the best buildings belong to the bourgeoisie. Our Soviets have confiscated all good buildings in towns and countries, from which the rich have transferred all of them to the workers and peasants for the unions and meetings. This is our freedom of assembly for the working people. This is the meaning and content of our socialist constitution. That is why we are all so firmly convinced that no matter what misfortunes may still be in store for it, our Republic of Soviets is invincible. It is invincible because every blow struck by frenzied imperialism, every defeat the international bourgeoisie inflict on us, rouses more and more sections of the workers and peasants to the struggle, teaches them at the cost of enormous sacrifice, stills them and engenders new heroism on a mass scale.
We know that help from you will probably not come soon, comrade American workers, for the revolution is developing in different countries in different forms and at different tempos, and it cannot be otherwise. We know that although the European proletarian revolution has been maturing very rapidly lately, it may, after all, not flare up within the next few weeks. We are banking on the inevitability of the world revolution, but this does not mean that we are such fools as to bank on the revolution inevitably coming on a definite and early date. We have seen two great revolutions in our country, 1905 and 1917, and we know the revolutions are not made in order or by agreement. We know that circumstances brought our Russian detachment of the socialist proletariat to the fore, not because of our merits, but because of the exceptional backwardness of Russia, and that before the world revolution breaks out, a number of separate revolutions may be defeated. In spite of this, we are firmly convinced that we are inevitable, because the spirit of mankind will not be broken by the imperialist slaughter. Mankind will vanquish it, and the first country to break the convict chains of the imperialist war was our country. We sustained enormously heavy casualties in the struggle to break these chains, but we broke them. We are free from imperialist dependence. We have raised the banner of struggle for the complete overthrow of imperialism for the whole world to see. We are now, as it were, in a besieged fortress, waiting for the other detachments of the world socialist revolution to come to our relief.
These detachments exist. They are more numerous than ours. They are maturing, growing, gaining more strength the longer the brutalities of imperialism continue. The workers are breaking away from their social traitors. The Gomperses, the Hendersons, Ronaldans, the Schneidmans, and the Renners. Slowly but surely, the workers are adopting communist, Bolshevik tactics and are marching toward the proletariat revolution, which alone is capable of saving dying culture and dying mankind. In short, we are invincible. We are the world proletariat revolution in short, we are invincible because the world proletariat revolution is invincible.
Wow, that was truly inspiring. Wow. Oh wow, that was a document.
That was the most tanky. That was
Go
the
ahead,
most
go ahead.
tanky thing I've ever seen anyone made.
We're at war. That was
Yeah.
beautiful. Oh wow. Do you guys want to go right into the questions, or do you want to just go around and do an initial response to the text? I think we'll do an. I'll start with an initial response.
Okay.
Yeah, that like Joe said, that was one of the most tanky things ever written. I think what I'm really inspired by is hearing a socialist that actually understands reality and is trying to make changes in that reality and dealing with it, in real time. Like, we don't want to talk to, as much as we hate the Trotskyites, if they are part of the union that is, in our town, we're not going to talk to those Trotskyites to help the conditions of the workers. Or what about talk with a Trump supporter or a Tea Party or someone who might not understand the latest understandings of gender theory? And we're trying to build workers' power and build community organizations. And here it is, somebody at war who just fought a revolution, got people out of war, and now he's trying to push and build socialism in his country, and he's appealing to the workers of a country that have recently invaded him. I mean, I'm just, wow, that's absolutely beautiful. And I think the other big thing that I really got was the urgency. Like these people aren't these lukewarm social democrats who went along with their country's imperialist to support the imperialist war. And you see that now. You see it with the Trotskyite groups, with the DSA, as the United States destabilizes and destroys the people of Syria, tries to destroy the governments in Venezuela. There's a world war going on right now of the imperialists in the West and the oppressed countries, and they are trying to destabilize and destroy the lives of our brothers and sisters in the global South. And it's time, and we can't just sit by and do nothing about it, or say, and put nuance on it, or say, wait for the goddamn worker struggle, or wait till it's perfect. We support the countries resisting imperialism. Those are our brothers and sisters and allies against the same fight here that denies us wages and health care and democratic rights. So sorry, I mean, it got me fired up, comrades. Maybe cool. Comrade Fox, maybe you could give a initial response to the text.
Well, I think it's a brilliant article, Leverage American Workers, because actually, read my rights, it's like a rallying cry for solidarity and for support as well, and internationalism. And I think this is a classic example how this can come about. They were under attack. They had invasion. They had a foreign invasion, and they're doing everything possible to save their revolution. And I think that was, basically flowing from that rallying cry and for solidarity. But around the world, actually, we had strikes, boycotts, anything, any type of strike to stop any imperialist aggression towards the Soviet Union. Happened here in Australia. There was goods held up and ships held up at the docks there. Same within the UK, same within Europe and other places. Workers were to become conscious to say, we're not going to tolerate this. And it was a really good way for them to develop that international solidarity, that what we can do practically to support each other, and especially if there is a revolution, same as the workers, well, how we actually support that as well. And also, I just wanted to mention boycotts as well. There was actually boycotts of various imperial products and that were supporting the invasion of the Soviet Union too. So, I mean, that all these things that came into place. So this was like a practical plan or a practical call to action moving forward. And I think that was quite fantastic. So Lenin was quite, he was quite visionary in how he called out of it. It wasn't just he wasn't there for begging and pleading for mercy. No, this was actually a call for actions for workers all around the world. And he did actually highlighted that were workers of the world, and it was and also carried on Karl Marx's tradition of workers of all countries unite.
Comrade Joe?
I've read this once before, but I forgot a good like how raw it really is, because he seems to be writing from an area of passion. Because he is in the middle of a war, and I really what else? I underlined some stuff as we were reading. That's why I got misplaced at one point. But I realized when when Lenin is talking about how he worked with a French monarchist to beat back the Germans. It reminded me of like the main how Mao Zedong talked about the main contradiction is American imperialism. And during the Russian Revolution, at the main contradiction was the Tsar and the German imperialists. So Lenin was justifying working with some monarchists who had similar interests at the time, because they really had no other choice. And the main contradiction at that time for Russia was the Tsar and the German imperialists. Now that changed. Now it's the United States, for going strong on a world record, has been the main contradiction for almost 100 years. But also, I'm like, another thing, he really justifies, like, he's not trying to sugarcoat the brutality of civil war at all. He's saying, well, the bourgeoisie says that, when they make terror during the revolutions, it's fine because it's in the name of capitalism against feudalism. But when we do it in the name of the majority and the people, then it's demonized. And he has that's a legitimate point that we can't be afraid to make. Now, no one wants that. No one wants a war. No one wants bloodshed. But every revolution in history, every communist revolution in history, was a last-ditch self-defense move. That's what. And once that happens, once the gun is picked up, then you have to act. You have to act that way, and you have to act swiftly. And I like how he's not trying to sugarcoat it. And he's like, "This is war." Like, he's like, "This is the real deal." And he also brings up the kulaks. Which I've read about Lenin bringing up the kulaks before, but apparently the kulaks were an issue and on the eye. The Bolsheviks had their eye on them even pre 1917. It sounds like. So they've been antagonistic towards the peasants for hundreds of years before then, and it just gives us more ammo to talk about if anyone asks us about, like, what was the deal with the kulaks. I mean, they were an oppressive force even pre-revolution. But yeah, I think this is really inspiring and really great. I just can't wait to get to the questions once we get to that.
Comrade Ryan?
Hi. So there are kind of like three main themes I think that stood out for me. Throughout the text, Lenin defines imperialism several times, and I think this is really important. And Lenin is the main figure in socialism, communism to to define what really imperialism is. And I looked at when his book on imperialism was published. I think it was like 2 years prior to him writing this, so it was probably pretty fresh. But this pamphlet here was really important in the early communist movement. This was written in 1918, 1 year before the Communist Party of the United States was formed. And so this communist comrade Alex talks about in the introduction here is that this was a really important pamphlet for American socialists in developing and understanding really what imperialism was. The second kind of theme that I took was Lenin makes this distinction between what he calls a revolutionary war and the imperialist wars of conquest. And he says that the revolutionary wars are kind of smeared as criminal, while the imperialist wars are justified. I thought that was really interesting. And I really like how Lenin highlights the rich revolutionary tradition of America. And in another book I'm reading by Nelson Perry, he says that the United States is the most revolutionary country in the history of the world, which I thought was an interesting statement because I feel like we don't get that from the synthetic left. But he really highlights the Revolutionary War and the significance that had in defeating the British imperialists and the Civil War in overturning, getting rid of slavery and completely changing who the ruling class was from before slavery to after slavery, or after the Civil War. The third kind of theme that stood out to me were he goes on one of these pages about the agreements, and he makes this he shows how the agreement that he had to do with the French and the Germans, how that was similar to the same agreements that the American revolutionaries did with the French and the Spanish in their war. And I thought that was really interesting.
Right on. If I go on, the very first question is, what was the historical context of Lenin's letter? And I believe Ryan answered that very well at the beginning. Does anyone have anything to add to that question? No? Okay, so we'll go on to the next question. Is Lenin correct in the way he describes the American Revolution and the Civil War? And I do think he's correct. I mean, you got to take into consideration that Lincoln, was a racist, and the war didn't start. I mean, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, was trying to keep the United States together to maintain, the system of their profits, and the war did not start to end slavery, but in the minds of working people who had to compete with slavery, the fiery abolitionist, like the man John Brown behind me, who gave his life to spark the Civil War, to the recently freed Afro-American brothers and sisters, who, like Harriet Tubman, who led troops in the battle in the Civil War to crush the power of the slave owners and to smash slavery. It was about slavery. And it was a coalition of, the northern capitalists with workers, with farmers, and with free slaves. And it was a civil war necessary to smash slavery. And it was many Marxists refer to it as the second American Revolution. But at the same time, there was Union troops slaughtering indigenous people, and taking over and starting to take and taking over and fomenting the Anglo control over what became Aslan, the oppressed nation within the United States. So there's a host of contradictions And this is history. It's complicated and it's bloody, but it's real and it means something. And you're not just gonna find some ideal and then stick to that. As materialist people who understand reality are trying to move it forward, we have to have a historical dialectic perspective. Does anyone have anything to add on that question? Comrade Joe?
I think you summed it up pretty well. I think he had around the same idea, because I know that Marx himself really wanted to go to the United States, because Marx himself also thought there was a huge revolutionary potential in the United States, but he never actually made it to the United States. So I think Lenin had was trying very, very hard in his letter to get some kind of revolutionary fervor going in the United States, which, I mean, the Communist Party formed a year later, so that definitely had an effect. But I mean, from that time until right during this class, the United States is the center of the world empire, and that's where the next revolution has to start. So I mean, I think that he was very effective in that, and we can still take example of it. I mean, things have changed slightly, but you can still take from it 100%. Even today, it's applicable.
I missed the entire first part of that question. It says, is Lenin correct in the way he describes the American Revolution and the Civil War? I focused on the Civil War. Comrade Ryan, maybe you could talk a little bit about the American Revolution. I know there's this theory amongst the left that the American Revolution was actually counter-revolutionary somehow. I think the reasoning behind it is somehow the British were somehow less in favor of slavery, which I think is absolutely ridiculous when the main ally of the South, even 100 years later, propping up the South, was British capitalists. But maybe you could answer the question about is Lenin right in describing the American Revolution, Comrade Ryan?
Well, yeah, I've heard that theory too, that it was a counter-revolutionary war. I guess what my response from reading from that Nelson Peary book, he says that we have the most revolutionary country, and the reason for that was because feudalism never existed in this country. We kind of just went straight to capitalism right away with that Revolutionary War. So we've never had to kind of deal with the contradictions of having that capital accumulation that happened with feudalism and dealing with the landed property issues that other countries have had to deal with. We kind of were very revolutionary in the sense that we had this full-blown capitalism right away. I think it's interesting how he points out when he says on 180 at the same time. When I heard that, I thought of there's this dialectic relationship between the United States being the most revolutionary country, but yet we're the most imperialist country at this time, and we've been kind of dealing with that. And I think we're yet to resolve that contradiction, and that's part of the revolutionary potential of America.
Comrade Fox, anything to add on the question? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I'm not from the United States, so I'm sort of looking on the outside into the looking in. I think the two parts of that question, the American Revolution, and I think he was actually correct, because it was a change. It was basically the people of the then eastern states, or these coasts, they're forming their own country. It was very particularly important. There was actually a break in the chain of British imperial power at the time, which was still was probably the leading empire of that time, and still was right up to probably, you could say, arguably say, up to World War II. So that was important. It was important for in that sense where they were fighting that and when the people were forming their own destiny. And in relation to the Civil War, well, yes, I think he was quite correct. It was actually and referring back to William Z. Foster's The Three Internationals, Karl Marx wrote extensively to Abraham Lincoln, called on support through the First International that to get behind the Union and defeat the Confederacy and remove chattel slavery. So that was it was vitally important. So what Lenin's actually done is just built on that enriched literature and that practice of both Marx and Engels and the previous communists in the past. And I think it was quite that way how he described it as well. Mm.
Comrade Joe, do you have something to add?
Yeah. So of course, when he said in regards to the American Revolution, so of course the founding fathers themselves were reactionary, but it was really the Revolutionary War. At the surface, was a war between two different ruling classes. But the people who toiled under the founding fathers and under the British Empire, it was a lot of them felt like it was switching one ruling class for the next, and it was. If you read if you listen to Michael Parenti's talk, The Myth of the Founding Fathers, he goes into this. The masses of people saw the overthrow of Britain, and when they saw these aristocrats and large landowners and like super rich come into power in Philadelphia, and of course the only people who could afford to take off for 3 months and write a constitution was the super rich. When they saw that happening, they to get rabble rousing, and the founding fathers were horrified of democracy just as much as the king was. It was Jefferson and I forget who else who said that they should have some semblance of popular government. But if you read the Federalist Papers, I think it's Federalist Papers number 9 or 11. I'm not sure which one. It says that they want the image of popular government, but none of the substance. They say this, and John Adams, who was the scribe for that in that room in Philadelphia, he wrote pretty much everything down that was said in that entire room, in that room full of people. A lot of them were saying that like the purpose of the state is to protect those with property from those who do not. This goes on. I mean, Adam Smith has even said this. I mean, they always were constantly talking about like the threat of the mob. They only believed the wealthy and well-born should be able to vote. And for the first few years, I mean, I'm sure you guys know this. The first few years of in the United States, you had to own property to vote. One of the only progressive founding fathers was Thomas Paine, and he was kicked out once he accused some other members of being war profiteers, which they were. But so I think that it ignited the revolutionary spirit of the American people, but that ruling class, that regime, the Washington regime, took over from the British regime. But the masses of people themselves in the United States, that revolutionary flame was ignited. But we did trade one oppressor for the next, which is important. But I recommend you guys listen to The Myth of the Founding Fathers. It's a talk by Parenti. It's very good.
Okay.
Thank you for that very good insight, Comrade Ryan.
Yeah, one more thing to add. Our founding fathers in the United States did inspire other revolutionaries. For example, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, he quoted our founding fathers in his independence speech, or one of his speeches, quoting, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights." So there are other revolutionaries who think that we were revolutionary.
Good point. I really like the level of analysis going on here. We're not arguing a point one way or the other. We're simply trying to find out the reality and what it means for the revolutionary tradition of the United States. And that's not pushing it one way or the other. It's trying to figure out the truth. I often say I always look towards, in the American Revolution, I look toward Daniel Shays, who was a poor farmer who fought and risked his life to kick out the monarchy, to kick out the crown. And then he was put down and his people were slaughtered when they realized that George Washington was the new banking class. And then, even in U.S. history class, you're taught, well, the reason why they had to form the Constitution was because the government was weak, and that Daniel Shays' rebellion showed them that it was weak. So the only reason why they formed the Constitution was to make form an army to put down the workers and also to stop local governments from forgiving farmers loans and stuff like that. That's part of the rights of property in the United States, to stop local governments from forgiving debts. I think we probably spent a long time on that question. I think we have some good input here. Shout out to Karena Cree Paez of Telejaguar, who says, yes, when pain became a threat, the fundamental ideas of the settler project, he was treated as such.
Right.
And it's also good to put that, to look at this from all sides. So I guess we'll go on to the next question here. Comrade Joe, could you take the next question for us?
The next question. Which one would that be? Just the comments? I've never been on this app before, so I wish,
it's in the manual, page 194.
Did
Third
the
question.
Soviet Union change its approach to the American working class?
No. Yes. No, we're on, is Lenin effective?
Oh, did we do that? Okay.
No.
Is Lenin effective in explaining the circumstances facing Soviet Russia to the American audience? I mean, I kind of thought we were on that one before, because we skipped the American Revolution and Civil War one. But basically, yes. But basically, what I said was, Lenin saw that there was a lot of potential, like we've been talking about, within the United States, and I think he really wanted to ignite some sort of ignite some kind of fervor, especially during this revolutionary time. The U.S. government definitely took it seriously, because following the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a Red Scare where anyone even loosely associated with the communists was arrested and put in jail. There's a good documentary about the IWW that goes into that. Of course, a lot of the IWW went to the Communist Party afterwards, but after the Bolshevik Revolution, they were panicking. The ruling class just started arresting anyone who was any kind of shade of pink. It was nuts. So I think the ruling class in the United States definitely felt it. So I think and like I said before, this whole letter, even though it's times have changed somewhat, I think that a lot can be taken from this. So I think it's definitely effective.
Let's see. So the question, is Lenin effective in explaining circumstances facing Soviet Russia to the American audience? I think he did a very good job. I really like the two examples that were already mentioned. The way the United States formed alliances in the American Revolution is how they formed alliances. It basically took U.S. history and used it to explain the current situation in Russia, which I think he did a very good job in doing that. I mean, he didn't have he didn't live in the United States. He didn't put it in, the common vocabulary of, the average worker, but someone with a basic understanding of history could begin to relate to his arguments. Comrade Ryan?
Yeah, I think the main circumstance facing Russia then was imperialism, and I think he did a very good job at describing what that was. But yeah, I don't think I have much more to add.
Okay, Comrade Fox.
I'm back. Hello?
Comrade Fox, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Comrade. All right. Do you have anything to add to the question of, is Lenin effective in explaining the circumstances facing Soviet Russia to the American audience?
I think so. I mean, it was the conditions of the time that you had to put that out to the workers in the US, and I think I think he was quite effective because I believe in the US there was actually a lot of support for the fledgling Soviet Union too amongst the workers in the various industries calling on strikes and boycotts. So that, and you can obviously see a very big growing working class there. So there's a two-pronged attack. There was what was happening on the ground in the US at the time amongst the workers, but also in the other way, what was happening in the Soviet Union, how he's going to get that message across and building that solidarity. And I think in some aspect it is quite an effective way of explaining it. I mean, it's one thing that's always been, I've always emphasised when talking to workers, keep it simple, keep it something that they can relate to as well, and that they can understand. Because if you get right into the whole language or verbalage, you can lose people quite quickly. So it had to be straight to the point. Had to explain it. This is the situation. This is what we can do, and this is how we can move forward. And I think that was fantastic. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see. Comrade Ryan, could you start the next question?
Did the Soviet Union change its approach to the American working class? And how is Lenin's letter different from later statements of the Soviet leaders directed at the US public? Honestly, I think I'll pass this to someone else.
Okay. Joe, you got anything? You got anything to add on that one?
Yeah, well, I think especially after World War II, I mean, there was a period of a very close, as close as they ever were in the 1930s and 40s between the Soviet Union and the United States, because of the threat of Nazi Germany and because of FDR's weird left Bonapartist positions with the Communist Party. But after World War II, the Soviet, I mean, I think the Soviet Union was right in this way, but the Soviet Union was telling the American people and that, their country is, their government's racist, it's imperialistic. I mean, which it was. I mean, but it was telling them that there's a threat to them, that like they don't care about them, that they're only there for the rich, which again, he's correct. But that necessarily, I mean, Lenin already brings that up, that there is a bourgeoisie in the United States, that they are oppressors. But not to my knowledge did I think that I know if the Soviets were still bringing up Civil War and the revolutionary spirit of the United States. I think during the Cold War they were just. I mean, I haven't seen every piece of statements to the American public from the Soviet Union, but I think it changed because of the heightened antagonistic nature post World War II. But I'm not too sure what exactly was said after those times.
Very good contribution. I think it's interesting. So in this, why the U.S. is invading them, while they just fought a war against the imperialist Germans. They're trying to build socialism, and they're like, American workers, you need to be steadfast against American imperialism. It is your right and your duty to help us in this war. Our enemies are your enemies. It's very beautiful, very militant. And then, the shift in World War II, it's like, holy crap, these disgusting backward Nazi monsters and Japanese imperialists are going to take over the world and are threatening all of humanity. We have to work with Roosevelt. We got to work with the Allies. So this was a very different message. But if I had to say today, what message we need to do, I would say this message of Lenin's letter is absolutely true today. There is no power of Nazi Germany. Honestly, a lot of Nazi German scientists and others came here, and a lot of the economic policies, as far as the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, were all adopted by the United States after World War II. The United States is the leading force of imperialism in the world. It is the imperial core. I often call Europe the imperial peripheral. And it's my thought that the reason why they have been able to maintain a strong labor movement and a semblance of communist parties is because the bourgeoisie that they face is weaker, because it is at the peripheral of imperialism. But here in the imperialist core, with an absolute power of the monopoly capitalists who strip political and economic power from our brothers and sisters and the global South, they were able to carry out the harsh repression of McCarthyism. And they were able to almost completely destroy communism and socialism, which was at the very core of the United States history. Was a big spark when you talk about May Day being the communist workers' holiday, starting in the United States, the IWW, the rich socialist revolutionary history in the United States. The way this absolute cabal has been able to suppress it, unlike in Europe where they actually somewhat needed to cooperate it to maintain power, they were able to smash it. And we got Reaganism and this disgusting neoliberalism that's been put all over the world. So now is a time more than ever for the American working class, the multinational American working class, to stand in solidarity with the oppressed people of the world and to fight against imperialism from the belly of the beast.
I think that's a
Sorry,
good. I think that's a good segue into our next question, because you were pretty much going into that.
Yeah.
And the next question is Fox. Wasn't it your turn for the question?
Yeah, I was
go
just
ahead.
with those two questions. I mean, I can't really sort of answer that first bit so much. I was just trying to think about, but the second part, how is Lenin's letter different from later statements of Soviet leaders directed at the U.S. public? I think it's because I was just looking at that last paragraph on page 193 and there's a short sentence at the end there, and about how workers were breaking away from the social traders and basically developing a socialist or communist consciousness and class consciousness there. And I think that that at the time, and I understand that period, the later part of World War I and the end of World War I, the influence of the Soviet Union was gaining foothold everywhere across the more developing world, or the industrialized world, but even where amongst the poorer countries, everything. So that's what I understand. So when he was appealing direct to an industrial heartland of the US, to the US workers, I think it's it was Lenin. It was different in such a way. It was appealing to that sentiment at the time of support for the first worker state anywhere, and the first socialist state anywhere. So I think that tactic was fantastic, and I like how he signed it off as, in short, we're invincible because the world proletarian revolution is invincible at the time, and in a lot of aspects that's true. So I think that's how it was different from the later statements of the Soviet leaders directed at the US public later on as time especially after the World War II and the start of the Cold War. It was certainly different. It was certainly quite different from there as well. That was different historical material circumstances of the mid-50s onwards compared to what was after World War I.
Comrade Joe, I saw you were going into the next question. Comrade Fox, could you read the next question, and then Comrade Joe can answer?
Would Lenin have changed his writing style or made different points if writing to American workers in the 1950s, the 1970s, or today?
I think I kind of went into that talking about the last question a little bit, but like I said, I didn't really read that much statements, U.S. I think it would be I think it would be, when in context to talking about the United States, I think it would be generally the same. I think that Lenin would probably talk a lot more about the weird divisions between the Republican and Democratic parties. Now they're both capitalist parties, but they both represent different parts of the bourgeoisie. But I think in terms of us having a revolutionary spirit and needing to create a competing power structure and a revolutionary movement, I mean, yeah, I think it would be, the form would change, but but I think the general idea behind it would be generally the same, 100%. If it was today, he wouldn't be talking about World War I, so it would be, the whole letter would be addressed to our situation, which I think is extremely important because this is something I've been thinking about recently. The United States is the most reactionary. It's the most capitalist in ideology, but at the same time, it also, in times when there's such heightened oppression like that, those counterparts awaken like a complete competing structure. The more extreme it gets, the more backlash it gets. And in the United States, with its extreme revolutionary history, I think that the ferocity of the empire towards its own people and the people abroad is on its way, leading up to a what's the word? A climax between the building of like revolutionary fervor here in the United States. A lot of people are getting fed up looking into socialism, getting more radical, and I hear so much pessimism that because of how reactionary the United States is, and because of how anti-communist it is, that it's never going to happen here, or it's not worth looking at here. But at the same time, socialism is more popular than it's ever been before. I think that the next place to have a world-shaking revolution, not just an election like in Peru, which is great and a huge achievement, but an earth-shattering revolution. I think the next place for something like that to happen, call me a fool, but I try to be optimistic, is the United States. And it can be a very scary thing. I mean, it might sound exciting, but it should be terrifying because of what's at stake here. I think kind of go off at a tangent, but you get the idea.
No, good tangent, comrade.
Interesting point.
Maybe if I could add, it kind of goes on what I was saying about the U.S. being the imperial core. He goes in here and he talks about how the U.S., if anybody could find it, it's like whether knowingly or unknowingly, the U.S. became mercenaries for imperialist wars. And that really, really applies. And I think and if we look at all of they call it the developed world. If you look at the so-called developed world, I call the imperialist war, the imperialist world.
Yep.
The conditions in the United States are the worst conditions. We have less access to healthcare. We are dying sooner. Our life expectancy is going down in the United States. We have some of the worst over-processed food. We have worse and worse housing conditions. And a lot of it has to do with the poverty draft of holding basic things that they have in the rest of the, imperialist, in the more of the peripheral imperialist countries, which, had the stronger labor unions and movements that haven't been crushed, because the U.S. needs to maintain imperialist world conquest.
Whoops.
Okay, I'm back. Because the United States needs to maintain this military of world conquest proportions, it puts us down lower and gives us less education, makes those conditions worse. And I think Comrade Joe said this very articulately. It is from the contradictions that the revolution comes. So it is the most exploited and the most dissatisfied with the system that will be willing to put forth the effort, even go through a civil war to change things for the better. So I would say there is a lot of revolutionary potential in the United States, especially amongst the internal colonies of Afro-America and the Black Belt South and our Chicano brothers and sisters in Aslan and Raza in general, but also working class people who are suffering in rural areas. I always say from the hood to the holler. People, and as Comrade Joe said, more and more and more people are coming to socialism, are becoming socialist, becoming favor of socialism every day. The imperialist ideology and the Cold War dogma that socialism is the enemy is coming to an end. But how are we going to do that? I mean, the system is crumbling all around us. The conditions are getting worse and worse and worse. The things are becoming unstable. We could eventually have a civil war on our hands. And the bourgeoisie has got all these different sections: rural against urban, black against white. They're playing us against each other for these battles amongst the capitalists, like Trump and and Biden, the smaller capitalists versus the larger. They got us battling out each other. I mean, but what do we need to do? How do we prepare? How these people who are coming to socialism, we need to make these organizations now. We need materialist, dialectic, working class controlled organizations independent of the bourgeois political narrative that can take power when the shit comes tumbling down. And that's the sad truth, and it's scary, but that's how it is. Comrades, any response? Any response to that? Comrade Ryan or David Fox? Go ahead.
Just one thing. Sorry, I've just got. I'll be back in 1 minute. Just I've got something. I'll be.
All right, Comrade Ryan.
Yeah, I have a response to this question. So, would Lenin's writing style have changed, or would he have made different points? So, overall, his message of anti-imperialism, I don't think wouldn't change. We're still living in the epoch of imperialism. We're the highest stage of capitalism. This is still the main primary contradiction today. But there have been some major changes in our economic conditions in these dates laid out. A lot of things have changed. So like during 1918, this was during World War I, right after the Revolution, during the Civil War. But in the 1950s, a lot of things changed. This is post-World War II. It was the Bretton Woods Agreement was in full swing. We had two superpowers in the world, a bipolar world. There was China had their revolution, so did Korea and Cuba. There's also the age of McCarthyism. So I think his writing style would have changed to address some of those conditions that we were dealing with in America. With McCarthyism, maybe he would have had to, I don't know, like change a lot of words, because maybe we wouldn't see this text. In the 70s, there was a lot of changes too. So we were in this crisis of capitalism and the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and this emergence of a world market. And I think that's a major shift that's happened from when this was written to what we live in today. Is we have this global market of international financiers and bankers. And this is also a period where China transitioned to kind of address these changes with Deng's reforms. And we also saw Vietnam with their revolution in the 1970s. And after this, today we don't have a Soviet Union, but during that neoliberal period is kind of maybe a unipolar world, but now we're kind of dealing with a multipolar world, and it's pretty clear that the U.S. empire and imperialism is falling, And there's this crisis of neoliberalism happening. That's what I think is behind Trump and Bernie, both of their movements. There's this response to see how to deal with these contradictions that capitalism just cannot solve.
Let's see. We're getting a little bit short on time. Let's see. Maybe if we want to do one go around and summation. Let's see. Comrade Fox, any closing words?
I think this has been a great study and discussion we've had today with this. I mean, it's obviously going through this. It's quite a lot of extensive material from Lenin, but going through something like this and having a discussion about it, and it's actually good. It's a good challenge for myself and anyone here in Australia, because we're trying to work it out. Okay, well, how would this apply to Australia as well, and how we could relate to it. I can't really comment too much on the US history side of it, but I don't think it's vitally important. Well, I think that with that last question, it was just talked about. I think even too, Lenin would address it to all workers around the world now, especially to Australia, because Australia is part of that US foreign imperial bloc. And it was interesting. I was just listening to a critical hour yesterday on one of the programs with Wilma Leon and Gala Nixon, and they describe US foreign policy now as a failed business plan. You might as well call it the US failed business plan instead of calling it a foreign policy, because it's just crumbling. It's falling to bits now. And I mean, they're trying to sell weapons. They're trying to sell planes that, as pilots would describe, as trying to fly a piano. They've got ships that if they were on mobilise against China, they'd be gone. They wouldn't know what to do. It's basically the whole thing's just imploding big time. And how fast it's going, it's actually, it's probably been clouded behind a lot of media verbalage, etc. But I think it's something very classical. I think Lenin would address this quite differently today than what he would have happened back in 1918. So, and as time progressed, obviously Lenin being dialectical and in his approach to everything, yes, he would have actually studied the material conditions, understood it, and applied it to the then and now, not to what was happening over 100 years ago.
Comrade Joe, any closing statements? You're muted.
Right, you're on mute.
I think this discussion was great. It's the first one I was at, but I think it was really constructive. Look forward to the next one for sure. I guess I'll leave with this. All those watching who are socialists, I think pretty sure it's everyone. When you're talking to someone who's new to socialism, what you should start with, not redistribution of wealth or anything like that. Just what most Americans are concerned with. Tell them that historically socialism has lowered taxes, or socialist states have had way lower taxes than capitalist states, because the state industries pay for everything, that pay for the social programs, because there's no profits going to the public budget. So that's like simple stuff, because I've found that a lot of people in the United States are obsessed with taxes, especially the right wingers, even some even normal everyday working people. Doesn't matter who, taxes always kick our asses because the rich find ways to get around it. Not only that, but also start with that socialism isn't redistribution of wealth, no matter how much the right likes to say it is. Every society redistributes wealth. It's just what they do, what states do. What socialism is a redistribution of economic power. That's putting the workers, farmers, and the lower classes in the seat of power to actually make decisions around society. It's economic power, not wealth. It's how wealth is distributed, not just redistribution of wealth. I mean, Marx argued against it in critique of the Gotha program. So I think talking about how, like, with socialism, there'd be universal healthcare and universal employment and low taxes, basic stuff. And then once you get over that, then imperialism, especially if you're talking to someone who's already against wars, I mean, then you have a one up. But basic ABC stuff, basic economist stuff is a good way to get to talk to you about socialism. But that's it for me. It's great to be here, though.
Right on. Comrade Ryan, any closing statements?
Yeah, so I think this text is really important. First time I heard it, it really inspired me, and I love the energy that he writes with in this piece. But I think we're still dealing with the same things he talks about in this text. We're still dealing with imperialism. We're still dealing with the social chauvinists and the synthetic left and the lackeys of bourgeois morality. And I think he points to some really important strategies that revolutionaries can take away. These agreements and finding common ground. I think that's a really important takeaway for me. And he says the proletariat may take advantage of the antagonisms between different groups of the bourgeoisie. And I think as the crisis of capitalism matures and the class struggle gets more intensified, we're going to see divisions within the ruling class. And that's understanding that, I think, has been key for me recently in understanding really what capitalism, how to understand the parties here in America, the Democrats and the Republicans, kind of what factions of capitalism they represent. I think taking an advantage of those antagonisms will be key to uniting the working class against our oppressors.
Right on. Before I close, Comrade Joe Gale, is there any way people can follow you on social media? Is there anything you're involved in that people can look into?
Yeah, I'm Joe the Red on YouTube. It's Joe the Red. It's Infowars. It's the Infowars video that pops up if you type in Program Socialist. On Twitter, I'm also Joe the Red. I'm in the Center for Political Innovation. I'm also in the Young Communist League, Communist Party, DSA. I mean, I'm involved with a bunch of groups. On Facebook, you can also add me on Facebook, but my Facebook name is Giuseppe Guglielmetti. That's my Italian name, so it can't be doxed. I will put it in the chat, I guess, or somewhere. I'll comment. I'll put it in there. But yeah, other than that, that's pretty much where you can find me.
Comrade Ryan?
Yeah, so you could probably find me by just my name on multiple accounts, Ryan Cotton. I'm pretty active on Facebook, but I also have my YouTube channel, which doesn't have a handle yet, but it's Class Analysis. And my Twitter handle is Medical Momentum. So you can find me at any of those places.
And I think I'll close with this thought for today. Imperialism is not some high in the sky, lofty word. Every dollar that they rob from our brothers and sisters in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, every cent they take from us, they can use it to build prisons, to stick us in jail, to pay police to beat us up, to spy on us when we try to get unions like that the mostly African-American workers did in Alabama trying to get a union. They can use that to spy on us, to stop us from asserting our power. There's a global fight against imperialism, and it is just as real here as it is around the world, comrades. Well, I think that's going to do it for tonight. And next week on the 12th, I'm going to be studying with the rapper Red Bolshevik. We're going to be studying talk on the question of philosophy by Mao Zedong. Maybe we might have Caleb Maupin joining us. We might have to change the time to 10 p.m. Look forward to that, comrades, and we'll see you next week. Good night, good morning, whatever it is. Have a good one. Oh, well, let's do our chant. We always do
whatever.
If y'all could repeat after me. Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to win.
Dare.
All power to the people.
All power to the people.